Through the Cyclone. By Dennis Drayton. On the second morning, Brown said the clouds meant there was going to be a storm. He claimed to have been a skipper on a rich man's racing yacht before the war. And Crawford, who was a sergeant, although not much of a one, operated a rowing boat business in Southampton, seemed to agree with what Brown said about boats. So even though they resented an enlisted man taking charge, the others had gone along with his alleged expertise. Then they heard the out-of-kilter droning of a Nazi bomber approaching from the north, and Brown suggested they take down the sail to be less conspicuous. So they did, and the enemy aircraft passed behind them at such a distance that they couldn't see exactly what type it was. But it either paid them no attention, or didn't see them at all, because it didn't come after them. And there was, in the next couple of hours, there was no sign of any Stukas. If the Germans are such great builders, Smith said to lighten the mood, how come they can't get the engines on their planes to synchronize? A few of them laughed at this. But deep down, they knew that Smith hadn't got over being in the bag. He was used to having 50 Italians surrender to him at bayonet point, and the shock of being captured by German paratroopers in his sleep had weighed him down. They also suspected that when they all volunteered for the escape, he was so desperate to go that he lied about being able to swim, which was one of the conditions that Crawford had insisted on for the escape. The boat was a Greek kayık. Brown said it was much the same size as a British whaler, but it seemed cramped and didn't have enough space for both fishermen and any fish they caught. And because it was roofed over with a cabin which took up most of the deck space, the inside was even more crowded. Brown said this would be good if they got into bad weather, as the water would not be able to swamp the boat. It seemed a very small space for 6 men. There were no officers. They had been taken away to their own camps, but even if they had not, the men would not have taken them. Officers had ordered them to surrender after that march over the mountains. They could have kept fighting and hiding out in the caves, even the least keen of them knew that. Especially after the lack of hygiene and dysentery in the POW camp with the German camp guards, a low criminal lot stealing their watches and rings. Nobody would admit to wanting to surrender after going through that. And then the weather changed, just like Brown predicted, and they forgot very quickly about any German aircraft because nobody in their right mind would set out into the wind and sea of this storm in a plane, nor in a boat either. Brown said the boat did about 4 knots, which didn't sound much like a fast march. But if the wind held, in a 24-hour day that was more than 90 nautical miles. And it was only about 270 nautical miles to Egypt. The prevailing winds blew that way, so they might sail there in 3 days. That sounded good. They were mostly young men, and wanted to believe it, and besides they only had food and water for 2 or maybe 3 days at the most. And they were already tired of the bread and olives the Cretan villagers had given them. As the wind rose, it whistled in the ropes, and the hard parts of the rigging tapped monotonously. The sails flapped at first, but Brown and Crawford tightened them, and then reduced how much was raised. Apart from the hiss of the hull through the water, and the occasional bluster of the wind in the ears, the sea itself was weirdly silent. The long waves surged past soundlessly. The rare break of a crest made a chuckling noise, quickly snatched away by the wind. Brown showed he knew his stuff, and steered the boat stern onto the wind and waves. He did say that the wind might blow them more towards Libya, which wasn't so good, and he would try to tack southeast while he still could. While he still could. They found out the full meaning of what that meant as the day wore on. The sky turned gray with piled-up clouds, and the sea changed color from light and dark blue to a sickly green to finally a dark gray reflecting the clouds. The waves grew steadily steeper, but still the little kayık lifted her stern gamely over each crest. Meldrum, who was from Brighton, volunteered to spell Brown on the grounds he had once taken out a rowing boat, and did okay at the start with a little coaching. Brown went into the cabin. "I'll try for 3 hours. You might try for some sleep, lads," he said. "It's shaping up to be a filthy night." There were a few half-hearted quips about floating brothels, and most of them were too queasy to lie down then. They regretted later, as the waves steepened, and in the afternoon, a gale was blowing, and Brown emerged in time to see the first wave that was taller from crest to trough than the height of the mast. After that, nobody much saw the sky except as a backdrop to the appalling piled-up towers of waves dashing at them. Meldrum lost control of the boat just before Brown spelled him, and the kite slid down the side of a wave and nearly capsized as the next wave hit it broadside on. After that, Meldrum was in charge of the bilge pump. After that, Brown stayed at the tiller or next to it while Crawford steered, all the way through the night. The others huddled inside the cabin for warmth as much as they could, wedged crossways to stop being thrown around after Smith had his front upper teeth smashed out pitching across the cabin. They tried to bail out the cabin, and the door did keep most of the water out, but in the misery an ankle-high swill of seawater, sawdust and vomit swirled around the floor. Hodges couldn't stop vomiting even when the others were empty, and in the end he coughed blood and they feared for his life. All through the night the storm raged, and Brown and Crawford tied themselves to the seat of the thwarts. There was no light, except for the compass and the phosphorescence of the wake and the breaking waves, but they drove on south-southwest, not daring the tack because the danger of the waves for immediate, and the danger of being blown ashore in Italian and German-occupied Libya was very far away. The wind blew itself out after almost 24 hours, and in the start of the lull Brown snatched another 3 hours' sleep, and when he came up urged Crawford to take 6 hours if he could. He tried to take a bearing when the sun finally broke through the clouds, and after scribbling mysteriously on the old Fisher map, doubtfully pronounced that they might have traveled 140 nautical miles and would need to tack back towards Alexandria, or they would fetch up somewhere like Tobruk. A circular swirl of dark clouds around them stretching to the horizon, and the boat still pitching violently over the waves, even though the chop was still steep, and the long combers were making themselves felt again as deeper, longer troughs and peaks every 7th wave or so, just as in the old superstition. Smith came out of the cabin, dried blood still coating his lips. "Hodges is in a bad way, Sarge," he lisped apologetically. "Wants to talk to you." Crawford reluctantly went into the cabin. Even in the poor light from the narrow cabin windows, Hodges looked haggard. They were all exhausted from seasickness and staying awake for 36 hours, but Hodges looked like death and was covered in vomit and blood. He retched even as Crawford approached. They had tied him into the bunk, and he held up his bound wrists. "Let me up, Sergeant. This is killing me. And anything would be better. Even drowning. At least it would end." "All right, lads, let him up," Crawford said. "It's a cruelty," he added when they protested. Hodges tried to wipe himself clean, but didn't make any moves to harm himself. Crawford went back on deck, and Brown said, "It's impossible to navigate, but I think we're close to land. I'm tacking back as far east as the boat can take. Will the lads hold up?" "All apart, Hodges," Crawford said. "His mind is gone. But I'm more worried about the battering the boat has taken. Surely the caulking is loose. There's a lot of water in the cabin." Brown was silent for a moment. "She does feel a bit lower in the water. Ask the lads to bail a bit more, and I'll take a look below." When he went down, he could see the water swirling through a seam, and they tore up a shirt and jammed it into the cracks in the wood with a knife. It slowed the flow of the water just enough that the pumps gained and the water level fell, but as the men got tired, the level rose again. In the late afternoon, a seabird with a red bill followed in the wake for a while. "Definitely near land," Brown said, but he sounded worried. The light was fading. The wind had dropped and the clouds had cleared away except to the south, which probably meant land. And the possibility of being blown onto the shore in the dark. Brown took 3 hours on the bunk, and when he woke, the motion of the sea was rougher and someone was missing. When he went on deck, he realized Hodges was gone. Nobody had seen him, and they assumed he had thrown himself over the side in the confusion of a minor squall. Meldrum and Crawford had kept the boat to the eastward as much as they could, but before dawn they could all hear the faint booming of the waves. A clump of seaweed slid by them as well, another indication of land. The boat was wallowing sluggishly, and shuddered with every wave where before it had bobbed over much larger seas. Brown asked Meldrum to arrange a relay gang on the pump, but by the time the sun rose it was obvious they were losing to the leaks. "But we're nearly there," Smith said fretfully. "After coming all this way." By now, they were all far beyond exhaustion, and the food was gone, and Crawford handed out the last of the water in a small tobacco tin, barely more than a sip for each man. "We'll have to go in," Brown said at last. "The boat is going to sink sooner or later, and we'll have to take our chances. But let's take a look first." As they sailed closer to the coast, they could make out the spume of the breakers, and beyond that, low cliffs. "Buggery," Brown said in dismay. "Sorry, lads, we were blown a lot further west than I thought. This looks like the coast around Sidi Barrani. The good news is that there are some sandy beaches, if we can sail onto one. We'd still be taking our chances with drowning, but it's better than being wrecked against the cliffs." They took a vote, and were all for trying a beach. Brown took the kite in, and what they took for spray from the waves turned out to be a rain haze, and they couldn't see much more, and dared not go any closer. "Isn't the town a port?" Crawford asked. "Not much of a one," Brown said. "And I hope our blokes are there because the locals are Senussi or some such, and likely to cut our throats if there's no one British about." The boat lurched, and leaning over the side, Brown saw the waterline was now at the level of the ornamental stripe just below the gunwales. "Well, our feet won't get any wetter," said Smith with a chuckle from the pump. Brown steered toward a break in the cliffs, and it opened out into a long flat beach sloping gently towards the hills, and they murmured what would otherwise have been a cheer. The surf boomed now, and Brown yelled over it. "Hold on tight, we'll probably hit the bottom hard. Don't swim if you can help it. The undertow will just pull you back out. Just try to walk up to the beach. Keep your heads." And then a following wave spilled over the gunwales, and the kite didn't rise back out of the water, but it kept running forward. And as the waves receded, it gave one last surge and hit the bottom with deceptive gentleness. The moment threw them all off their feet except for Brown, seated at the tiller, and he yelled, "Now," and they dropped onto the waterlogged sand and tried to run against the water coming downhill. The wave hit them before they had time to brace themselves, and most of them went down, tumbled head over heels, but they all floundered back on their feet, and the shelf evened out, and the next wave didn't reach mid-thigh and they only staggered, and then they were in the shallows and laughing with elation.